watching NRATV with Bill Whittle.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to Hot Mike. I'm Bill Whittle here in Los Angeles. Hot Mike can't be here today. He bought a giraffe, so I'll be filling in for him. He should be back tomorrow. Today we've got a subject that I kind of want to stay on for the entire show, and it's this idea of hate speech. It's a fairly new idea in this country, but it's not a new idea elsewhere. When we think about the idea that you might say something that the government doesn't approve of, and you might be taken away, or you might have to face consequences for saying something that somebody didn't like. You don't normally think of the United States of America, or Minnesota either for that matter, but it's happening here, and it's all part of the collectivist plan to make sure that we do what we're supposed to do, which is mostly just shut up. So here's what led off the story today. The city of Minneapolis has set up a hotline, and the hotline is there for fellow citizens from Minneapolis to report other citizens if they should be making any anti-Muslim comments, any comments about jihad or any other hateful speech like that. And so we have right now here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, a law in the books that basically says that if you hear something that you think your neighbor is saying that is a little bit, that you find unpleasant, call the government, and the government will step in and take care of this problem for you. A lot of this has to do, of course, with how liberal Minneapolis is. Here's Minneapolis Mayor Betsy Hodges. She's going to be kind of a driving force behind this. Here's just a quote or two from Betsy. You can see her wearing her hijab there in solidarity. But here's what she had to say about this. She said, "I will not compromise the public safety of the people of Minneapolis to satisfy Trump's desire to put politics before public safety. Minneapolis is being built and strengthened by people from all over the world, and I am grateful for their commitment to our city." So for those of you that didn't get the message, you see, she's not going to bend to the, the genocidal rages and inclinations of the President of the United States. That's basically what she's trying to say. It's another example of this virtue signaling that I've talked about before, where everybody's so busy on the left showing each other how moral they are, especially showing those knuckle-dragging savages out there. It wasn't always like this in this country, you know. It wasn't. It wasn't always like this. We didn't have to walk around and tiptoeing around things that we say or shouldn't say or might say. We didn't suck in a breath when we heard perhaps a conservative radio host say something out loud, and you go, "My God, I can't believe he said that. I can't believe they let him say it." It's true. We all know it's true. This has been a pernicious, slow, and gradual and constant erosion on the idea that here in America we get to say whatever we damn well please, and if you don't like it, that's unfortunate for you. I think if you were to go into a modern high school today and say something that I'm sure they've never heard before, namely, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me," I think they'd look at you like you were from Mars. I don't think they could process what it is you're trying to say. But it wasn't always like this in America. As a matter of fact, you could make a pretty compelling case that race relations were improving right up until, really almost until Barack Obama decided that the way to govern the country was by splitting everybody up into these little tribes and having the tribes fight against the middle. But in any event, if you go back and watch a show from the early 70s, let's say, you go watch All in the Family, which is an extremely liberal show when you get right down to it. You could listen to any 10 minutes of All in the Family, and I mean pretty much any 10 minutes, and realize there's no way that show could be put on the air today. Not a chance. The Dean Martin roasts, you could see these people having fun with each other. You could see people who are lifelong friends and colleagues. They would come to this event to honor somebody who they really cared about and loved, and the way they do it is they'd insult them. A lot of times they'd insult them with their ethnicity, or they'd insult their nationality, insult them in whatever way. And they would insult them, and they would laugh, and everybody was pretty much happy. And before we get to our guest today, there's another example, too, because I want to come back to this a little later. One of the things I heard so much from people in World War II was that you would get, I'm sure it was other wars in this country's history, too, going back at least to the Revolution. But you would hear stories about how you'd get out there and you find yourself in the Ardennes forest in Germany in 1944, and you find out that the people who are in your platoon or your company, one guy's from Poland, another guy's a Catholic from Ireland, maybe you've got Spanish guys in there, and they use these epithets at each other. They just called each other these names, and maybe at first it was designed to put a little hostility up there, but over time these became terms of endearment, and these people would give their lives for that drunken Mick, or whatever the case may be. So my entire premise here today, and what I want to talk about today, is this idea that if we continue to make hate speech an actual thing here in the country, not only do we lose, it's not just the First Amendment, it's not just an important amendment. Everything, including the Second Amendment, follows from the fact that in America, you should get to say and think whatever you want to. The idea that the government or anyone else would be able to stop you from saying those things are repulsive, repugnant, and markedly anti-American. But the left is all of those things, and they're doing their very best to get there. So let's go ahead and bring in a guest who we have today, a very special guest who we very, very proud to have on today. It's conservative talk show host David Webb is joining us. David, there he is. David, how are you?
Hey, Bill, how are you?
I'm doing just fine, thanks. David, I think that probably one of the most conservative things that you could say in the country today would be to say that I have a dream that one day my children will be judged not by the content, not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I think that would be a reactionary, conservative, right-wing nutjob statement today. My entire understanding of the United States of America and freedom is the idea that we're all individuals, and some of us are good people and some of us not so good. But it seems to me that things have gotten a lot worse in terms of race relations and in terms of this idea of prosecuting some people because they say something that somebody else may not like.
Well, I mean, you're right on. And I'm actually going to take something from the American Bar Association here that I've used over time. And it's a Debating the Mighty Constitutional Opposites hate speech debate, which has been written on their website for some time now. It says hate speech is speech that offends, threatens, or insults groups based on race, color, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, disability, or other traits. Should hate speech be discouraged? The answer is easy, of course. But it goes on to write about the real debate on hate speech. And it's really very straightforward. Under the First Amendment, individuals do have a right to speech that the listener disagrees with and to speech that is offensive and hateful. Think about it. It's always easier to defend somebody's right to say something with which you agree. But in a free society, you also have a duty to defend speech to which you may strongly object. Those words matter. This article lays out the fundamental debate, that it is not about what I agree with or what I believe to be right now in the history of where we are now is offensive or not, or hate speech, but to go on and protect the future of the country, because at what time does someone else get to determine that something is, quote, hate speech and illegal? Is at the point, and you use a great example of the Battle of the Ardennes, one of the hardest battles ever fought in the history of the modern world, when side by side, many people who did not know each other, agree with each other culturally, called each other names that were then and today considered camaraderie or maybe offensive, but they fought their way through something to defend this principle that we have a constitution that will not surrender to those that oppose the right to speak or be offended. Your right to be offended is not my issue. I protect the Constitution.
That's exactly right. And, you might in World War II, going back to that example, you might have had actual genuine bigots in that company, genuine bigots who genuinely hated Jews, Bill, or genuinely hated whatever.
I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to give you an example of
hang on one
bigots
second,
in
Dave.
World War II. All right.
All I wanted to say is you might have people that are in fact bigoted that way, but most of that prejudice goes away if that person saves your life. If that person puts his life on the line for you, you are suddenly facing a different kind of reality. One of my favorite moments ever was it was George Will actually, was talking about the movie Glory. And the movie Glory is about the 54th Massachusetts, an all-black regiment in the Civil War. And during that movie, you can see that the Confederate soldiers despised the idea of black soldiers in the Union, but a lot of Union soldiers didn't like it either. And when they went marching into Fort Henry, I think it was Battery Wagner. When they were going into Battery Wagner, you had a lot of white soldiers looking at these black men going into battle with a great deal of prejudice. But once they saw what those men did out there, and once they saw that kind of heroism and bravery, it's very tough to remain prejudiced in the face of that kind of evidence. And George Will said, you cannot say, give me respect. You have to earn somebody's respect.
No, boy, what a great example. So I'm going to fast forward to a more modern example, and that is the Tuskegee Airmen. And I happen to know this gentleman well, Malcolm Nettingham, who was in the first class that was training engineers in communications, blacks and whites. And Malcolm recounted a story about a gentleman from Alabama, then a fellow soldier, who basically hated him for the color of his skin. But as they worked their way through the class, as they began to do their job, as they learned that they were there to protect America, and we can deal with our other issues aside from that, they became friends. Malcolm went on to go into communications, work for the AT&T, one of the big companies. He's now one of the still living Tuskegee Airmen. And he told me a second part of that story. Growing up in Scotch Plains, New Jersey, he did not experience the bigotry that others did around the country. The country, to your point, and what a great mixing of two different periods in American history, that the country was not universal. In Scotch Plains, New Jersey, he had a good existence as a black man pre-civil rights. And it wasn't the greatest world, but in that world with his close neighborhood and friends, blacks and whites did not see each other the way we're told everything had to be according to the liberals. It's a very complex world, and people, to George Will's point and to your point, they're judged by their actions.
That's right, by their actions. And if you happen to be a particularly prejudiced, B-17 pilot over Germany, and you're trying to fight your way home and just make it back with your crew, and all of a sudden the red tails appear in P-51 Mustangs, you look out the window, you got black fighter pilots escorting you home. They're the only squadron that never lost a bomber. And after a while, that would be pretty reassuring. This is the kind of thing that changes people's minds, not lecturing and not any of this, don't say this, can't say that. I think the more energy we put into telling people what we're not allowed to say, the better. And I cannot let Tuskegee pass without saying that Booker T. Washington's attitude towards hate and race and prejudice and all the things that the left is trying to basically criminalize was the exact opposite of what we see today. Booker T. Washington basically told his students at Tuskegee, we're going to have to hold you to a higher standard, not even to an equal standard, to a higher standard. And the black students that Booker T. Washington was graduating out of Tuskegee Institute had higher test scores than the national white average. They had a lower illegitimacy rate than the white average. They were in every way better citizens because they were dealing with the issue face on and not trying to demand respect, legislate prejudice away, and all the other things that are just flat out impossible.
Well, they also did something important, Bill. They solved the problem that existed then. Think about it. We have reversed the course of racism, the slavery that happened in the colonial world. Here in America, the actions of men like Booker T. Washington, the support of women like the suffragettes, largely a white Republican group, and the actions of many others led to where we were in the 60s, and we suddenly saw voting rights and civil rights emerge as a winning issue. And if you talk about Booker T. Washington, and I wish I had the quote in front of me right now, but I spoke about it years ago in one of my speeches where I cited how I can't cite it word for word, but he talked about the certain group of people in this country who don't want the patient to get sick. They live off of this narrative of racism and bigotry, and they don't want the patient to get better, rather, because if the patient does, then they're out of business. What you're talking
They're
about
out
in
of a job.
Minneapolis is another example of what happens when people have this idea that they can force someone to think a certain way versus solving the problem.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And David, I want to come back and talk to you about some examples of this so-called hate speech and some examples where the entire idea just doesn't seem to exist in America today. That's mostly in the military. It's been my experience anyway. We'll be back right after the break. This is Hot Mike with Bill Whittle right here on NRATV.